My name is Jair, and I am a grave digger at a rural cemetery in the interior of Minas Gerais. Working here has always been peaceful. The place is isolated, surrounded by brush and silence. Most of the burials are of old residents from the area, and I know almost everyone. It all started a few months ago when I was finishing closing a grave at the end of the afternoon and felt like I was being watched. I looked up and saw two glowing points in the middle of the brush. At first, I thought they might be the eyes of some animal, maybe a cat or a dog, but those eyes seemed fixed on me, as if they were studying me. I ignored it and continued my work, but that feeling of being watched wouldn't leave me. Weeks passed, and the eyes appeared several times, always at night. They seemed to be in different places, as if they were following me. I thought I was becoming paranoid. At first, the eyes appeared at the edge of the cemetery, near the line of trees. They stood out in the darkness, always glowing with a strange intensity. Every time I looked in their direction, the eyes remained motionless, fixed on me, as if they were waiting for something. It seemed like each night, the eyes were getting a little closer. Sometimes, while making my rounds, I would see them between the tombstones, glowing with a cold and penetrating light. I started to feel a chill every time I saw them, as if a cold draft were passing over me. It was a strange feeling of being observed and judged at the same time. I told a few colleagues and even my wife, but everyone laughed, saying it must be something in my head or at most some nocturnal animal. This upset me because I knew something strange was happening. One night, the eyes appeared near the cemetery office where I did my paperwork and stored the tools. This time, they were closer than ever, almost at the edge of the streetlight illuminating the entrance. I felt my heart race and my hand tremble while holding the flashlight. When I shone the light in the direction of the eyes, they disappeared into the dark. But the feeling that something was wrong became even stronger. During the day, I looked for tracks or signs of animals near the spot where I had seen the eyes, but I found nothing. No tracks, no clues. It was as if those eyes appeared from nowhere and vanished into nothing every night. The presence of the eyes became more oppressive. I knew they weren't the eyes of ordinary animals. There was something human about them, something that made me uneasy. I started sleeping poorly, always feeling like I was being watched, even at home. In the following nights, I became more vigilant during my night rounds. I carried a more powerful flashlight and, as a precaution, a knife. The cemetery has no security, and I needed to feel protected. When the eyes appeared, I would shine the light in their direction, but I never saw anything besides a glow disappearing into the dark. The eyes began to appear more frequently. They seemed to be everywhere, always watching me. It was as if they were surrounding me, cornering me slowly. During my rounds, I could feel the eyes on me, even when I couldn't see them. It was as if they were there, hidden in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to appear. My nerves were on edge, and any noise in the middle of the night made me jump. One night, while walking between the tombstones, I saw the eyes once again, but this time they seemed different. They were closer, more intense, as if they wanted to tell me something. I shone the flashlight in their direction, but as always, they disappeared into the dark. In the third week after the eyes started appearing, something terrible happened. It was an especially dark and silent night, typical for the rural cemetery where I worked. During my round, I noticed the glowing eyes were closer again. They seemed to be located near an old and almost forgotten tomb. With my heart racing and the flashlight firm in my hand, my knife in the other, I approached the spot. The shadows around seemed to move strangely, and I knew something was about to be revealed. Suddenly, the shadows began to take shape. They transformed into an indistinct mass of darkness with those glowing eyes I had seen so many times before. Before I could react or understand what was happening, the shadows leaped at me. The sensation was like visible cicadas attacking me. I fought with all my strength. The claws were sharp and fast, and I felt as if they were tearing my skin, leaving deep and painful marks. The pain was intense, and the attack seemed endless. Finally, the shadows receded and disappeared into the darkness, but I was completely exhausted and wounded. With difficulty, I managed to reach the cemetery office. I treated my wounds as best as I could and immediately called the hospital. On the way, the fear and pain were almost unbearable. At the hospital, the doctors assessed my wounds and said they appeared to be deep cuts, as if made by the claws of some animal. They treated the wounds and, as a precaution, gave me shots to prevent animal-borne diseases. The claws were different, and the sensation was of something much more sinister. But since there was no better explanation, I didn't say anything to the doctors. I left the hospital with the feeling that something was very wrong. The fear and panic still haunted me, and the glowing eyes continued to appear in my nightmares. I knew what I experienced was real and could not be explained by anything ordinary. The experience left deep scars, not just on my skin, but also on my mind. Whatever attacked me was not a simple animal. The shadows and the glowing eyes continued to disturb me in my nightmares. I have no idea what attacked me, but I don't want to find out. As soon as I was able, I resigned from the cemetery and found another job a few months later. But I will never forget that night. The shadows and the glowing eyes continue to haunt my life. My name is Enrique. I was a grave digger for 20 years at Conceição Cemetery in Sao Paulo. I've seen many strange things in that time, but nothing compares to what happened a few months ago. It was a normal workday, and I was going about my usual routine, digging, maintaining the tombstones, and making repairs when necessary. That morning, I received an order to prepare a new grave. I started digging as usual, enjoying the silence and peace of the cemetery, which to many is a dark place, but for me, it has always been a refuge of tranquility. After a few hours of work, my shovel hit something hard. Initially, I thought it was a rock, which wasn't uncommon, but as I continued digging, I realized it wasn't a rock. It was something stranger. I cleared the dirt around it, and what I saw chilled me to the bone, a tattered and faded old wedding dress buried with a skeleton. The dress was dirty, torn, and faded by time. The remains were in poor condition, almost disintegrating at the touch. Who would bury a bride there in a shallow grave with no identification? The situation didn't make sense. The cemetery has strict rules about burials and graves, and this clearly didn't follow any of them. I felt a shiver down my spine. I'm not easily scared, but this find unsettled me. I looked around, but I was alone. The cemetery's silence felt heavier, as if the entire place was watching what I was doing. I decided I couldn't just ignore it. I immediately went to the cemetery administration and reported what I had found. My superior, Claudio, listened attentively and seemed concerned. After a brief conversation, he gave me an instruction that I found somewhat strange. He said to rebury the body in a different, more remote location. I asked if this procedure was correct, as in all my years of work, I had never seen or heard of anything like this. Claudio simply told me it was an order and that I should follow it. There was something in the way he spoke that made me uncomfortable, but I obeyed. I returned to the site with a heavy feeling in my chest. Carefully, I reburied the body in the most dignified manner possible. The new location was in a more secluded part of the cemetery, where few people visited. Throughout the process, I couldn't get the image of that wedding dress and the skeleton out of my mind. Something was wrong. In the following days, after reburial, life in the cemetery seemed to return to normal, or at least, that's what I thought. I continued with my tasks, trying to shake off the discomfort caused by the discovery of the buried bride. However, it didn't take long for things to start getting strange. It was a Thursday night, after visiting hours, and I was finishing closing the main gate when I saw a pale figure between the tombstones from a distance. At first, I thought it was a visitor who hadn't left in time. I grabbed my flashlight and went over to check to see if the cemetery was closing. As I got closer, the figure became clearer. It was a woman dressed in a dirty, torn wedding dress, very similar to what I had found buried. My blood ran cold. She was facing away from me, her shoulders shaking as if she was crying. I approached closer, calling out to her, but she didn't respond. When I was a few meters away, she stopped crying and slowly turned around. What I saw was a terrifying sight. Her face was pale and disfigured with deep, sad eyes. Before I could do anything, she vanished as if she had dissolved into the air. I was paralyzed, unable to believe what I had just seen. I went home shaken, unable to sleep properly. The next morning, upon arriving at work, I found Claudio and told him about what I had seen. He looked at me with a serious expression and said I should ignore it, that it was just my imagination because of the recent find. I tried to follow his advice, but the apparitions continued in the following days. Always at night, I saw the bride crying in different parts of the cemetery. Sometimes, I would hear the sound of her crying even without seeing her. The situation was leaving me disturbed and afraid to work at night. I started looking for information about the cemetery and possible stories of brides buried there, but I found nothing in the official records. I decided to ask the older grave diggers, but they all seemed reluctant to talk about it. One of them, an older man named Louise, pulled me aside and told me not to get involved any further. He said strange things had always happened there, and that it was better to leave it alone. Days turned into weeks, and the presence of the ghostly bride became increasingly intense. I tried everything to find out who she might have been. I combed through old records, asked longtime residents of the neighborhood, and even looked for local stories that might give a clue, but nothing. It was as if she had never existed in the records. Each time, it was a new torment. The bride appeared more frequently, always crying, always watching me with those sad, empty eyes. I would hear her crying echoing through the tombstones and feel her gaze following me even when I couldn't see her directly. The cemetery, which had once been familiar and even comforting, had become a constant nightmare. I told my wife what was happening, but she thought I was overwhelmed and imagining things. Close friends also didn't believe, saying it was the accumulated stress from years of work. But I knew it was real. With each passing night, my sanity was slipping away a little more. In a final effort, I decided to talk to Claudio and Louise again. I explained the situation and begged for some information or guidance, but all I received were pitying looks and advice to let it go. Joao, who had always been supportive, suggested I take some time off, but I knew that wouldn't solve the problem. Working at the cemetery had become unbearable. The presence of the bride wouldn't let me rest, and each day, I felt my mental balance deteriorating until I finally reached my limit. I could no longer sleep, couldn't eat properly, and working at the cemetery had become a psychological torture. That's when I made the most difficult decision of my life. I resigned. I could no longer continue in that place surrounded by memories and visions that haunted me relentlessly. I explained my decision to my superior, who, although surprised, accepted my resignation without much questioning. On my last day, before leaving, I went to the spot where I had found the wedding dress. I stayed there for a few minutes in silence, as if I were saying goodbye to the ghostly bride. I don't know if it was my imagination, but I felt an intense cold around me, as if she were watching me one last time. As I left the cemetery, I felt a mix of relief and sadness. I had spent 20 years of my life there, but I knew I couldn't continue. The scars from that experience still haunt me, and even today, sometimes I hear the distant sound of crying that gives me chills. In 1979, I was working as a grave digger at a cemetery that the City Hall decided to close. They decided to open a new cemetery, but they didn't hire anyone from the old one. I suddenly found myself unemployed as a grave digger. It was the only thing I knew how to do well. I looked for a job in the neighboring city, and by coincidence, the cemetery there was looking for a new grave digger. The previous one had resigned, but no one explained the reason. I found it strange, but I didn't have time to be picky about jobs. I needed to support my family. I went to the cemetery administrator's office, and after a brief conversation about my experience, they hired me on the spot. They offered me accommodation in a place away from the cemetery. Since I was from another city, I accepted immediately. I needed the job. They told me I would take the night shift, which was the only available slot. Although I preferred to work during the day, I accepted because the job was what mattered. The house they provided was simple but comfortable enough. The downside was that I would be away from my wife and 2 children. So, one of my few requirements for the job was to have 2 consecutive days off per week. I arranged this with my boss so I could spend those 2 days with my family. My wife wasn't too happy about the idea, but I promised that as soon as a position opened up at the new cemetery in our city, I would try to get it. My new routine started almost immediately. From Monday to Friday, I worked from 7 p.m. to 7 a.m. The nights were quiet, with only a few rounds and maintenance of the graves. On weekends, I took time off and went home to be with my wife and children. Living in the cemetery had its advantages and disadvantages. The main advantage was proximity to work. I didn't need to waste time commuting or spend money on gas. The disadvantage was the solitude, but I soon got used to it. During the first week, I noticed that nights in the cemetery were different from what I was used to in the old one. I worked during the day there and had never experienced the feeling of being alone in such a large, story-filled place. The tombstones and graves seemed to come alive at night, casting shadows that moved with the wind and making noises that I couldn't identify. Getting to know the team was a gradual process. There was a caretaker, a security guard, and the administrator. They were all friendly, but it seemed like there was something they didn't talk about, a kind of secret. The security guard, Mr. Antonio, was the oldest in the group and always had strange stories about the cemetery. He told me that some bizarre things had happened there, but he never went into details. In the first week, my job was simple. Walk through the cemetery, check that everything was in order, ensure there were no intruders, and perform basic maintenance on the graves. The nights were long and silent, but I made a point to follow the routine strictly, always alert for anything out of the ordinary. Early on, I noticed that loneliness was a constant companion. The silence was only interrupted by the natural sounds of the place, the rustling of leaves, the distant call of a night bird, or the occasional bark of a dog. These sounds, which would go unnoticed during the day, took on a frightening tone at night. The house I lived in was simple but comfortable. It had a small garden in front and was set away from the cemetery, which gave me a bit of privacy. In the first few days, I had trouble sleeping during the day, but I soon got used to it. The routine was exhausting, but I needed the job and was determined to do my best. A few weeks passed, and I started noticing some strange things. On one of my night rounds, I found that one of the graves was open. I went to investigate, thinking it might be the work of vandals, but there were no signs of tampering. It was out of place, as if the lid had been carefully removed and then put back. I heard whispers coming from one of the older areas of the cemetery. I went there but found nothing. These things started to unsettle me, but I tried to stay calm and continue with my work. On one particularly dark night, while making my rounds, I felt a strange chill, as if someone were watching me. I looked around but saw no one. I continued my work, but the feeling didn't go away. I decided to finish the rounds quickly and return to the cemetery office. During these lonely nights, I began to question if accepting the night shift had been a good idea. The cemetery, which had once seemed like a tranquil place, now felt a bit frightening. Even so, I needed the job and was determined not to let these oddities affect me. Over time, I became more familiar with the cemetery's routine and realized that, despite its oddities, it was a place that demanded respect and care. I kept the graves clean and well-maintained, made repairs when necessary, and above all, maintained peace and order during the nights. It was in the third week of work that everything became strange. It was a night like any other when I saw a young girl, about 13 years old, walking through the cemetery. I was surprised and concerned because the cemetery was closed at night and no one should be there. I went to talk to the girl. She was scared and said she was going to visit a grave. I found it odd but didn't want to scare her further. I asked her to wait on a bench outside the office while I called the police. As soon as I hung up the phone and returned to talk to the girl, she was gone. The police arrived quickly, in less than 5 minutes. I explained what had happened, and they began searching the cemetery but found nothing. They suggested that I was tired and seeing things, which left me with a nagging doubt. I knew what I had seen. It couldn't be that I was imagining all of it. The girl had seemed so real, so scared, but after the police left, I began to doubt myself. Was I really seeing things? In the following days, I continued with my normal routine. A week later, there she was again, the same girl, the same scared appearance. This time, I didn't want to scare her or waste time calling the police without first trying to understand what was happening. I asked her again what she was doing there, and once again, she said she was going to visit a grave. I decided to take a different approach. I asked the name of the person she wanted to visit, and she gave a name I didn't recognize. I took the girl to the cemetery office and checked the records, but found nothing with the name she mentioned. When I returned to talk to her, she had disappeared again. This started to mess with my mind. Who was this girl? And why did she appear only to disappear immediately afterward? A few days later, while making my rounds, I encountered the girl again. This time, I decided not to ask direct questions and just followed her while she walked through the cemetery. She seemed to know exactly where she was going, so I decided to follow without questioning too much. Curiosity and concern were eating away at me. As we walked, I tried to engage in conversation to understand better who she was. I asked her name, and with a vacant look, she said her name was the same as the grave she was looking for. That sent a chill down my spine, but I continued walking alongside her. I asked about her parents, and she said she didn't know where they were and that it had been a long time since she had seen them. I could feel the sadness in her voice. We continued walking in silence for a while, and the curiosity and discomfort only grew. Finally, we arrived in front of an old, almost forgotten grave, hidden among newer graves. The girl stopped and looked at me. She calmly said that she was afraid of knives. I was surprised and my heart raced. I always carried a knife with me during rounds to protect myself from potential intruders or animals that might enter the cemetery. She seemed to know this, which intrigued me even more. Before I could ask why she was afraid of knives, she continued speaking in a serene but sad voice. She said she had been killed with a knife and was buried there, right where we were standing. At that moment, a shiver ran down my spine. Her voice sounded so real, so full of pain. I was paralyzed for a moment, trying to process what she had just said. When I looked back at her, the girl was no longer there. The place seemed colder and darker. My heart was pounding, and I felt a mix of fear and sadness. I ran back to my house in the cemetery and locked the door. I spent the rest of the night awake, thinking about the girl's story. When morning came, I spoke to my superior, explained what had happened without going into too many details to avoid seeming crazy, and requested to switch to the day shift and to stop living inside the cemetery. To my surprise, he accepted my request without asking many questions, which made me suspicious that he might know something I didn't. Even though I had to drive over an hour and a half every day, I thought it was the best decision. I preferred the weariness of the commute to the strange feeling the cemetery gave me at night. I began working during the day, and the routine became more bearable. But every time I passed by the girl's grave, I felt a chill. Something told me her story wasn't over. A few months later, a friend offered me a job in a new venture he was starting. Without thinking twice, I accepted. The job was close to my home, allowing me to be with my family and not worry about the dead anymore.